Welcome to Crash Course History. My name is Jared, and alongside me is Steven. In today's video, we will be discussing the topic of the Civil Rights Movement.
But before we dive into this main topic, here are some events that led up to this movement.
So to dive in 1868, the Fourth Amendment was passed, a constitutional amendment that forbids any state from depriving citizens of their rights and privileges and defines citizenship.
In 1905, there was Niagara movements. W.E. Du Bois demands immediate racial equality and opposes all laws that treat blacks as different from others, leads to the creation of the NAACP in 1909.
In 1915, Grandfather Clause outlawed by Supreme Court. The NAACP successfully challenges state laws that restricted black voting registration.
In 1919, race riots and lynchings claim hundreds of lives. Over 25 race riots occur in the summer of 1919, with 13 killed in Chicago. 70 blacks, including 10 veterans, are lynched in the South.
In 1942, Japanese Americans are sent to concentration camps. Concerned over potential disloyalty, FDR allows 110,000 people to be rounded up in the western states, although not in Hawaii.
In 1947, Jackie Robinson joins the Brooklyn Dodgers. Robinson breaks the color barrier by being the first black to play Major League Baseball in modern times.
In the fall of 1957, Little Rock Central High School is desegregated. After Little Rock School Board votes to integrate schools, National Guard troops prevent black children from attending school. 1,000 federal paratroopers are needed to escort black students and preserve peace. Arkansas's Governor Fabas responds by closing schools for the 1958-1959 school year.
The first topic that sparked the civil rights movement was the Montgomery bus boycott from 1955 to 1957. Rosa Parks ignites 380-day bus boycott organized by Martin Luther King Jr., regarded as the first large-scale demonstration against segregation in the U.S. On December 1, 1955, 4 days before the boycott began, Rosa Parks, an African-American woman, refused to yield her seat to a white man on the Montgomery bus. She was arrested and fined. The boycott of public buses by blacks in Montgomery began on the day of Parks' court hearing and lasted 381
days. This is where the African Americans started to mobilize. As news of the boycott spread, African American leaders across Montgomery, Alabama, capital city, began lending their support. Black ministers announced the boycott in church on Sunday, December 4th, and the Montgomery Advertiser, a general interest newspaper, published a front-page article on the planned action. Approximately 40,000 African American bus riders, the majority of the city's black bus riders, boycotted the system the next day. On the afternoon of December 5th, black leaders met to form the Montgomery Improvement Association, the MIA. The group elected Martin Luther King Jr., the 26-year-old pastor of Montgomery's Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, as its president, and decided to hold the boycott until the city met its demands. At a mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church, the MIA voted to continue the boycott. King spoke to several thousand people at the meeting, saying, "I want it to be known that we are going to work with grim and bold determination to gain justice on the buses in this city. And we are not wrong. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong." After unsuccessfully talking with the city commissioners and bus company officials, on December 8th, the MIA issued a formal list of demands, courteous treatments by bus operators, first come first served seating for all, with black seating from the rear and whites from the front, and the black bus operators on predominantly black routes. The U.S. Supreme Court ultimately ordered Montgomery to integrate its bus system.
In 1961, the Freedom Riders opposed segregation. Blacks and whites take buses to the south to protest bus station segregation. Many are greeted with riots and beatings. The Freedom Riders, organized by CORE, were modeled after the organization's 1947 Journey of Reconciliation. A big difference between the 1947 Journey of Reconciliation and the 1961 Freedom Rides was the inclusion of women in the later initiative. In both actions, black riders traveled to the American South, where segregation continued to occur, and attempted to use white-only restrooms, lunch counters, and waiting rooms. The group reached Atlanta, Georgia, where some of the riders split off onto a Trailways bus. On May 14, 1961, the Greyhound bus was the first to arrive in Anniston, Alabama. There, an angry mob of about 200 white people surrounded the bus, causing the driver to continue past the bus station. The mob followed the bus in the automobiles, and when the tires on the bus blew out, someone threw a bomb into the bus. The Freedom Riders escaped the bus as it burst into flames, only to be brutally beaten by members of the surrounding mob. The second bus, a Trailways vehicle, traveled to Birmingham, Alabama that day, and those riders were also beaten by an angry white mob, many of whom brandished metal pipes.
Photographs of the burning Greyhound bus and the bloody riders appeared on the front pages of the newspapers throughout the country and around the world the next day. drawing international attention to the Freedom Riders' cause and the state of race relations in the U.S. Following the widespread violence, Corps officials could not find a bus driver who would agree to transport integrated groups, and they decided to abandon the Freedom Riders. However, Diane Nash, an activist from the CNCC, organized a group of 10 students from Nashville, Tennessee, to continue the rides. U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, brother of President John F. Kennedy, began negotiating with Governor John Patterson of Alabama and the bus companies to secure a driver and state protection for the new group of the Freedom Riders. The riders finally resumed on a Greyhound bus departing in Birmingham under police escort on May 20th. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. led a service at the First Baptist Church in Montgomery, which was attended by more than 1,000 supporters of the Freedom Riders. A riot ensued outside the church, and King called Robert Kennedy to ask for protection. Kennedy summoned the federal marshals, who used tear gas to disperse the white mobs. Patterson declared martial law in the city and dispatched the National Guard to restore order. The riots continued over the next several months, and that fall, under pressure from Kennedy's administration, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued regulations prohibiting segregation in interstate.
Blacks faced continuing discrimination in the post-war years. The March on Washington group met annually to reiterate blacks' demands for economic equality. The civil rights movement of the 1960s transformed the political climate, and in 1963, black leaders began to plan a new March on Washington, designed specifically to advocate passage of the Civil Rights Act and then stalled in Congress. Chaired again by A. Philip Randolph and organized by his longtime associate Bayard Rustin, this new March for Jobs and Freedom was expected to attract 100,000 participants. President John F. Kennedy showed as little enthusiasm for the march as had Roosevelt, but this time the black leaders would not be dissuaded. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference put aside their long-standing rivalry. White groups across the country were urged to attend, and elaborate arrangements were made to ensure a harmonious event. The march was an unprecedented success. More than 200,000 black and white Americans shared a joyous day of speeches, songs, and prayers led by a celebrated array of clergymen, civil rights leaders, politicians, and entertainers. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's soaring address climaxed the day. Through his eloquence, the phrase, "I have a dream," became an expression of the highest aspirations of the civil rights movement. Like its predecessors, the March on Washington of 1963 was followed by years of disillusion and racial strife. Nevertheless, both marches represented an affirmation of hope, of belief in the democratic process, and the faith in the capacity of blacks and whites to work together for racial equality.
The Civil Rights Act passed July 1964, overcoming the Senate. Congress passes laws forbidding racial discrimination in many areas of life, including hotels, voting, employment, and schools. When John F. Kennedy entered the White House in 1961, he initially delayed in supporting new anti-discrimination measures. But with protests springing up throughout the South, including one in Birmingham, Alabama, where police brutally suppressed nonviolent demonstrators with dogs, clubs, and high-pressure fire hoses, Kennedy decided to act. Kennedy realized that the United States simply could not declare itself a champion of freedom throughout the world while maintaining a system of racial inequality at home. In June 1963, he proposed by far the most comprehensive civil rights legislation to date, saying the United States will not fully be free until all of its citizens are free. Kennedy was assassinated that November in Dallas, which after new President Lyndon B. Johnson immediately took up the cause. Let this session of Congress be known as a session which did more for civil rights than the last 100 sessions combined, Johnson said in his first State of the Union address. In a mischievous attempt to sabotage the bill, a Virginia segregationist introduced an amendment to ban employment discrimination against women. That one passed, whereas over 100 other hostile amendments were defeated. In the end, Mississippi Summer Freedom Project in 1964 was when the civil rights workers seeked to register blacks to vote. Freedom Summer was a voter registration project in Mississippi, part of a larger effort by civil rights groups such as the Congress on Racial Equality, the CORE, to expand black voting in the South. The Mississippi Project was run by the Council of Federal Organizations, COFO, an organization of rights in which CNCC was the most active member. About 100 white college students had helped COFO register voters in November 1963, and several hundred more students were invited in 1964 for Freedom Summer, a much expanded voter registration project. Mississippi was chosen as the site of the Freedom Summer Project due to its historically low levels of African American voter registration. In 1962, less than 7% of the state's eligible black voters were registered to vote. On June 15, 1964, the first 300 arrived. The next day, two of the white students, Michael Schwammer and Andrew Goodman, both from New York, and a local African American, James Chaney, disappeared. Although their badly beaten bodies were not discovered for 6 weeks, certainly that they had been murdered swept the country. In Mississippi, the murders shook the project profoundly, surrounded by threats and violence. The workers resented the lack of federal protection and the slowness of the investigation. The events of Freedom Summer deepened the division between those in the civil rights movement who still believed in integration and nonviolence and others, especially young Afro-Americans who now doubted whether racial equality was achievable by peaceful means. The civil rights movement continued to be active.
Even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 forbade discrimination in voting on the basis of race, efforts by civil rights organizations such as the Southern Christian Leadership Council and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to register black voters was met with fierce resistance in southern states such as Alabama. Alabama Governor George Wallace was a notorious opponent of desegregation, and the local county sheriff in Dallas County had led a steadfast opposition to black voter registration. As a result, only 2% of Selma's eligible black voters, 300 out of 15,000, had managed to register. On February 18th, white segregationists attacked a group of peaceful demonstrators in the nearby town of Marion. In the ensuing chaos, an Alabama state trooper fatally shot Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young African-American demonstrator. In response to Jackson's death, King and the SCLC planned a massive protest march from the Selma to the capital of Montgomery, 54 miles away. A group of 600 people met out on Sunday, March 7th, but didn't get far before Alabama state troopers, wielding whips, nightsticks, and tear gas, rushed the group at the Edmund Pettus Bridge and beat them back to Selma. King himself led another attempt on March 9th, but turned the marchers around when the state troopers again blocked the road. That night, a group of segregationists beat another protester, a young white minister, James Reed, to death. Alabama state officials tried to prevent the march from going forward, but a U.S. District Court judge ordered them to permit it. President Lyndon Johnson also backed the marchers, going on national television to pledge his support and lobby for passage of new voting rights legislation he was introducing in Congress. 2,000 people set out from Selma on March 21st, protected by U.S. Army troops and Alabama National Guard forces that Johnson had ordered under federal control. After walking some 12 hours a day and sleeping in fields on the way, they reached Montgomery on March 25th. Nearly 50,000 supporters, black and white, met the marchers in Montgomery, where they gathered in front of the state capitol to hear King and other speakers. Two most well-known civil rights activists who also had the biggest contributions was Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Martin Luther King was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He was a Baptist minister and a civil rights activist. He was credited with the creation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. King is most famously known for his I Have a Dream speech in 1963. Sadly, King was assassinated on April 1968. King was a visionary leader that was dedicated to achieving social justice in a non-violent way. Malcolm X was born on May 19, 1925. Malcolm was a popular black nationalist leader who represented the Nation of Islam during the 1950s and 60s. Articulate and a natural gifted speaker, Malcolm X convinced and exhorted blacks not to tolerate racism by any means necessary. Just like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21, 1965. Continuity and change. There has been giant leaps in social justice since the civil rights movement. Because of people like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X, African Americans and other minorities are able to live their life at full potential without the fear of prejudice or violence directed towards them. Unfortunately, there are still problems within North America regarding racism. Topics such as police brutality and prejudices towards religious groups like Islam.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Well, that ends this episode of Crash Course History. Tune in next week for a new video.